The rider emerged from the western horizon, a dark silhouette against the bleeding orange sky, and Clara Whitmore almost missed him entirely. She was up to her elbows in soapy water, fiercely scrubbing a pair of her late husband's denim trousers she couldn't yet bear to discard, when a jagged movement caught her eye through the weathered fence line. It was a bay horse, moving with a desperate, stumbling gait that spoke of broken things trying to remember how to function. Even from afar, the absolute wrongness of it struck her like a physical blow. The rider wasn't sitting upright. He was slumped entirely forward over the saddle horn, his body curved inward, as if shielding something precious from the dying light. Clara froze, the heavy silence of the Nebraska prairie pressing down on her. There was no one to call for help. Her 2 hired men had ridden out days ago, leaving her alone with the vast, indifferent land. She knew the crushing weight of isolation well. Wiping her damp hands on her coarse apron, she stepped toward the gate. The horse managed perhaps 30 more paces before it surrendered. It didn't spook or startle, it simply quit with a devastating finality, its legs violently trembling before its head dropped to the dry dirt. First the front knees buckled, then the hindquarters, and the beast collapsed sideways into the dust. The unconscious man slid with it, rolling limply onto the dry earth, lying perfectly still as the dust settled around him. Clara was running before the man even stopped rolling. She reached his side in seconds, dropping to her knees in the suffocating prairie dust. He was sprawled face down, revealing a shirt shredded in multiple places and a dark, crusted patch of blood across his left shoulder blade. It was an old wound, she noted instantly, at least a day or 2 unwashed. Gently, she rolled him over. His face was a map of suffering, the skin across his nose and cheeks burned raw by the relentless sun, his lips split and bleeding, his eyes firmly shut against the world. "Hey," she urged, gripping his uninjured shoulder and giving him a firm shake. "Hey there, mister." In the deafening quiet of the plains, she heard it. A sound so fragile and out of place, she thought the wind was playing tricks on her mind. It was a thin, wavering whimper. Not a sound a grown man could make. Her gaze darted to his chest. His thick, dust-caked coat was bundled awkwardly, and she realized his arms were locked around it, secured tightly by a length of rough rope looped over his shoulders. He had tied his own arms to his body, ensuring that even in the black depths of unconsciousness, he would not drop whatever he carried. It was a testament to a desperate, heartbreaking stubbornness. Working the stiff knot with trembling fingers, she finally pulled the heavy coat aside. Peering up at her from the sweat-dampened folds of a yellow, blue-edged, homemade shawl were 2 tiny, flushed faces. They were twin infant girls, likely no more than 3 months old, slick with sweat and radiating heat. Suddenly exposed to the cooling evening air, both began to wail, that frantic, questioning cry of newborns, demanding to know why the world had suddenly turned so harsh. Clara stared from the screaming infants to the barely breathing man, her mind racing against the fading light. "Okay," she muttered to the empty prairie, buying her brain a second to strategize. "Okay." The stark reality was, she couldn't carry all 3 at once. She gathered the damp bundle of babies first, clutching them securely against her chest, and hurried them up the wooden porch steps. Depositing them in a deep, high-sided laundry basket where they couldn't roll away, she sprinted back for the rider. Dead weight made him incredibly heavy, and it took 2 grueling attempts and a flurry of curses she normally saved for stubborn mules to haul him upright. Step by agonizing step, she dragged his boot-scraping form up to the porch and through the front door. The sitting room floor was as far as her aching arms could manage. As she dropped him onto the wooden floorboards, a low groan rattled in his throat. "Good," Clara breathed, wiping sweat from her brow. "That means you're not a corpse." Leaving him momentarily, she rushed to the kitchen, pumping a basin full of fresh water and grabbing every clean cotton rag she possessed before returning to the chaos. The twins were furious, their tiny lungs expressing the profound injustice of their hunger. Clara knew she couldn't simply feed them whatever she had without caution. She needed to ease their stomachs. Mixing a small amount of canned milk with warm water in a tin cup, she tested the heat on her wrist and spent an exhausting 20 minutes coaxing drops into their tiny mouths. The screaming eventually dialed down to a weary, exhausted whimpering. With the babies momentarily settled, she turned to the rider. Searching his pockets for clues, she found a crumpled paper bearing the name Silas Boone in a handwriting that didn't look like a signature. Whether it was his name or a dead man's note, she didn't know. She cut away his shirt, finding the shoulder wound a nasty, infected gash, likely from a bad fall rather than a bullet. She cleaned it, packed it with fresh cloth, and bound it tight. Peeling off his ruined boots, she winced at the severe blisters completely covering his soles. But his hands told the real story. The palms were shredded raw, the skin worn completely through from gripping leather reins with an absolute uncompromising terror. Near midnight, Silas woke. It wasn't a peaceful return to the living. His eyes snapped open, staring blankly at the ceiling before raw panic set in. His ruined hands began grasping wildly at the empty air, searching for the bundle that was no longer there. "The babies," Clara said sharply, cutting through his rising panic before it could fully take root. "They're safe. They're right over there." Silas whipped his head toward the laundry basket 3 feet away. Both girls were finally asleep, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect, peaceful rhythm. Silas stared at them, his throat working as he swallowed dryly. "They took some milk," Clara offered softly. "I'll need to head into town at first light for proper supplies, but tonight, they're alive. You kept them alive." He didn't speak for a long time, drawing breath deliberately, as if remembering how the machinery of his lungs operated. "You own this land?" His voice cracked, a rough, broken rasp. Clara nodded. "I do. Husband passed 2 winters back." Silas absorbed the information, his eyes distant. "I didn't know where else to ride. Heard a rumor once about a decent widow out this way." Clara stared at him, incredulous. "You rode over 30 miles on a rumor?" Silas almost laughed, but the sound died in his ruined throat. "I wasn't thinking too clearly," he confessed. When Clara asked who the children were, the shadow of a deep horror crossed his sunburned face. "Found them 4 days past. Wagon train east of the Platte. Everyone was dead." He spoke with the terrifying flatness of a man who had repeated the nightmare to himself 1,000 times. "The mother. She hid them under the floorboards. She died lying over the hatch to keep them quiet." Silas explained he hadn't dared follow the main road, terrified the slaughtering party would return to check their brutal work. He had cut cross-country, riding his horse to its death to save the infant daughters of a family named Cowboy, whose Bible he had briefly glimpsed in the wreckage. "You did right," Clara told him firmly, shutting down the doubt swimming in his exhausted eyes. She ordered him to sleep, promising that the rest of the world could wait until morning. For the next 18 hours, Silas didn't move. Clara, however, survived on fractured slivers of sleep, riding 6 miles into town at dawn. She cornered the general store owner, securing soft rubber teats, clean cloth, and more canned milk, with a tone that dared him to ask questions about her so-called visiting relatives. By the time she returned, the girls were awake and vocal. She quickly learned their distinct personalities. One possessed a faint crescent birthmark behind her left ear. She woke angry and stayed that way. The other was eerily calm until she escalated to a furious scream in mere seconds. Clara dubbed them Rose and Wren in her mind, a temporary measure she falsely swore meant nothing. Sitting on the sunlit porch that afternoon, feeding a baby on each knee, the screen door groaned. Silas stepped out, walking like a man cataloguing his broken parts. He looked at the vast, burning gold of the prairie, looked at Clara, and finally whispered a ragged, "Thank you." Clara cut off his gratitude quickly, telling him to save his thanks until he could stand up straight enough to be useful. Silas, noting her strict practicality, didn't argue. He watched the infant without the birthmark, Wren, as Clara called her, staring at him with profound, unblinking suspicion. When asked about his plans, Silas stated he needed to reach the law. The local sheriff had to document the slaughter at the Platte and initiate a search for the girl's surviving kin. Clara looked down at the fragile lives currently anchoring her to the porch, stating simply that in the meantime, she would keep them breathing. 3 days later, Sheriff Nathan Hale rode up the dusty drive. He was a broad, weathered man whose slow, deliberate manner masked a sharp intellect. For hours, Silas detailed the massacre in the sitting room while Clara stayed out of sight, listening to the heavy pauses that marked the darkest parts of the retelling. When Hale finally emerged, turning his hat in his calloused hands, he confirmed he would send word east to Ohio and Kansas, looking for the Calloway family. Recognizing the immediate reality, the sheriff agreed to file temporary custody papers for Clara, observing her fiercely protective stance with a mixture of quiet pity and deep respect. The nights quickly became an exercise in relentless endurance. The twins operated on fractured schedules, entirely indifferent to adult exhaustion. Rose demanded a slow, rhythmic patting on her back to settle, while Wren required her arms to be pinned securely while someone spoke to her in a low, monotonous drone. On the fifth night, Silas appeared in the doorway at 4 in the morning, unprompted. Without asking permission, he scooped a screaming wren from her basket and began recounting a tedious story about a horse stuck in a creek bed, utilizing the exact low timber Clara had described. To Clara's astonishment, the infant's cries hitched and ceased, her wide eyes locking onto the strange man before slowly drifting shut. Silas dryly suggested the child was falling asleep out of pure spite, drawing a weary, genuine smile from Clara. They spent the remainder of the dark hours slumped against the lower kitchen cabinets, too drained to seek real furniture. In the quiet, they traded fragments of their pasts. Silas spoke of an estranged family in Missouri, while Clara confessed her initial hatred for the unforgiving Nebraska plains, admitting that after 7 years and a buried husband, she had finally grown to understand the quiet. Clara awoke the next morning to the smell of brewing coffee and a heavy woolen blanket draped over her stiff shoulders. Silas stood by the window, a steaming tin cup in his bandaged hands, watching the dawn bleed across the endless grass. "You looked less like a ghost today." The haunted hollows of his face had settled into something resembling quiet resolve. As the morning light hit the kitchen, illuminating the sleeping infants, Clara marveled at the sheer improbability of their makeshift household standing defiant against the massive, indifferent prairie. Later that morning, while preparing to wash Silas's ruined coat, Clara's fingers brushed something rigid, sewn deep inside the lining. Working the threads loose, she extracted a small square of paper, carefully wrapped in waterproof oilcloth. It was a letter, penned in elegant, school-taught script, dated just 11 days prior. The salutation struck Clara breathless. "To whoever finds my daughters." Dropping heavily to the wooden floorboards, Clara read the desperate final words of June Calloway. Written in her last, unbroken hour, the mother detailed the impending attack, the specific livestock brands of the approaching riders, and her final, humble prayer for her children. That they know each other, have enough to eat, and that the world might show them a little kindness. Their names were Eleanor and May. Clara sat motionless on the floor, the weight of the letter pressing into her chest. She had been privately calling them Rose and Wren, pretending the names held no meaning, but Eleanor and May made them terrifyingly real. June Calloway had used her final moments to whisper a plea to the universe, and the universe, in its chaotic, bloody fashion, had delivered that plea to a lonely widow's kitchen in Nebraska. The heavy thump of boots on the porch announced Silas's return from the barn. He moved better today, accommodating his battered ribs with a grim acceptance. Seeing the ashen look on Clara's face, he stepped inside. Without a word, she handed him the oilcloth-wrapped paper. Silas read the elegant script standing up, his jaw muscles clenching so hard Clara thought his teeth might crack. He whispered June's name like a prayer, a bitter regret coloring his voice as he admitted he should have checked the family Bible more thoroughly. Clara sharply reminded him that he had been busy saving 2 lives while bleeding out himself. Setting his empty cup down with a sharp clatter, Silas declared the sheriff needed to see the letter immediately. To burn off his surging adrenaline, he announced he was going to fix the sagging east fence, stubbornly refusing to let his injuries stop him. As he walked out, Clara went to pick up a crying May, abandoning the temporary names forever.
Sheriff Nathan Hale returned the next morning with a nervous young deputy in tow. Seated at the sturdy kitchen table, Hale read June's final testament, while Silas stood rigidly by the window. The letter detailed the killer's horse brands, a notched double-bar R on the left flank. Hale's weathered face tightened. He knew the mark well. It belonged to a ruthless cattle-running syndicate operating just north of the Platte River, hiding dirty deeds behind a legitimate trading front. Silas's eyes flashed with a dangerous, quiet fire as he demanded to know the leader's name, but Hale flatly refused. The cautious lawman warned that riding in half-cocked without ironclad evidence would only scatter the murderous outfit into the deep plains. For now, Silas had to bleed every agonizing detail into the trembling deputy's notebook to build a legitimate noose. When Clara pressed about the infant's fate, Hale admitted he was still hunting down the Kansas sister and the Ohio cousins. The wheels of justice moved at a glacial pace, leaving Eleanor and May squarely in Clara's temporary, yet increasingly fierce protection. After the lawmen departed, the kitchen fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Clara slid a steaming mug of coffee in front of Silas, noting how he had intentionally swallowed his words 3 separate times during his official statement. Pushed gently, Silas finally fractured. He stared into the black coffee and confessed the ghosts he had omitted. There had been a teenage boy at the wagon train, brutally tortured and lashed to a splintered wagon wheel. Silas had cut him loose, but the boy's throat was ruined. Whether by terror or a blade, he couldn't say. Silas had abandoned his search of the other wagons to sit in the bloody dirt with the dying youth, holding a stranger's hand for 3 agonizing hours until the boy passed. Guilt gnawed at him. By staying, he might have missed other survivors, yet leaving the boy to die alone was an unforgivable sin. Clara sat across from him, her voice a steady anchor in his storm of regret. She told him that staying with the dying boy wasn't a failure, it was a brutal mercy. He had done what he could in a waking nightmare, and that had to be enough. The suffocating summer heatwave finally shattered in the second week with a violent, sky-bruising storm that rolled in off the northwest plains. The temperature plunged as vicious hail battered the glass, followed by a torrential deluge that made the old ranch house groan in its bones. Eleanor wept a steady, miserable rhythm, while May simply stared at the ceiling with an expression of profound, silent offense. Silas scooped up the rigid infant, settling into the warmest chair by the stove, murmuring low, monotonous assurances about the rain that magically kept her calm. In the dim, flickering lamplight, Clara realized Silas looked as though he had always belonged in this kitchen. Seeking a distraction from the thunder, she asked him for a story. He spoke of an old man playing a piano in an Abilene saloon years ago, his ruined hands coaxing out the most beautiful music Silas had ever heard. In return, Clara offered a piece of her own bruised heart. She confessed how her late husband used to whistle tuneless, irritating melodies while he worked, a sound she would now trade her soul to hear just one more time. The shared silence that followed was thick with quiet understanding. The fragile domestic rhythm they had built was abruptly threatened when Sheriff Hale rode out the following Thursday. Staring into his coffee cup, Hale delivered the ugly truth. The local townsfolk were actively gossiping about the widow Whitmore harboring a strange man under her roof. In a territory governed by strict, judgmental morals, this scandal could poison Clara's chances of keeping the twins if a custody battle arose. Silas immediately offered to sleep out in the drafty barn, his voice devoid of ego, but Clara furiously shut the idea down. The sheer absurdity of prioritizing town whispers over survival enraged her. Yet the reality of his prolonged stay forced a deeper reckoning that evening on the darkened porch. Under a canopy of low, heavy stars, Silas finally surrendered the complete, uncensored horror of the river crossing. He described the copper stench of blood, finding June Calloway purposely draped over the wagon hatch to muffle her children, and how he had painstakingly dug graves in the rocky soil for her and the boy. He confessed his lingering terror that he hadn't done enough. Clara looked at the broken, honorable man beside her,
and swore that no one could have given more. The crushing weight of the outside world finally breached their sanctuary on a humid Friday afternoon. The teenage supply rider handed Clara an envelope bearing an elegant, forward-slanting script from Cincinnati, Ohio. It was from Vivian Ashcraft, the late Thomas Calloway's older sister. Clara read the commanding words at the kitchen table, her blood running cold. Vivian offered stiff sympathies before declaring, without a hint of negotiation, her imminent arrival in exactly 3 weeks to collect her nieces. She intended to drag them back east to a life of proper society and wealth, assuming the rough Nebraska ranch was entirely unsuited for the infants. Clara hid the letter until the twins were asleep, handing it to Silas on the moonlit porch. He read it in grim silence, his jaw locking tight. A blood relative held an almost insurmountable legal claim. When Silas quietly asked what she wanted to do, Clara admitted she needed to meet this Cincinnati woman before deciding her next move. But deep in her soul, a terrifying realization bloomed. She had already begun to think of Eleanor and May as her own blood. Exactly 3 weeks later, the undeniable force of Vivian Ashcraft rolled up the dusty drive in a hired coach, shattering the fragile peace of the Whitmore ranch. Clara and Silas stood waiting in the sun-baked yard, a deliberate, united front. Vivian descended with the practiced elegance of a woman accustomed to commanding every room she entered. Dressed in understated, expensive fabrics that defied the gritty Nebraska wind, her silver-templed hair framed a face that was sharp, assessing, and thoroughly unyielding. She didn't ask questions, she made statements, greeting Clara as a fixed fact and acknowledging Silas's role in the rescue with a cool, measured nod. Vivian's gaze swept over the weathered homestead. She was here to execute a rescue of her own, operating under the staunch belief that this rough frontier existence was merely a tragic detour for her blood. When she finally stepped inside the dim, warm sitting room, she found Eleanor and May awake in the sturdy wooden cradle Silas had recently crafted. For a singular, heart-stopping moment, the Cincinnati matriarch's iron composure fractured. Staring down at her dead brother's orphaned daughters, raw, naked grief washed over Vivian's aristocratic features. Yet, just as quickly, the mask slammed back into place. She didn't reach out to touch them. She merely crouched, observing them with a clinical intensity that made Clara's protective instincts flare hot and bright. Straightening her skirts, Vivian remarked on the infant's robust health with a detached professionalism, as if appraising livestock. Clara met her cool stare, detailing their feeding schedules and distinct temperaments with fierce precision. She explained how Eleanor, marked by a pale crescent behind her ear, was thoughtful and steady, while May possessed a furious set of lungs that demanded the world's absolute attention between 7 and 8 every evening. A ghost of a smile flickered across Vivian's stern mouth as she noted that May's fiery spirit sounded exactly like her late mother, June. Instead of packing the children away immediately, the wealthy aunt announced she would observe the household for a few days before finalizing her extraction. The ensuing 4 days were a battlefield of wills. Vivian possessed loud opinions on everything from the drafty house to the feeding routines, delivering criticisms without a shred of hesitation. But the wealthy widow was also full of startling contradictions. On the second night, Clara stumbled out of bed at 4 in the morning to find Vivian already standing by the window, expertly rocking a wailing Eleanor. Without looking away from the dark prairie, Vivian confessed she knew the grueling midnight hours well. She had buried her own husband and a young son long ago. On the third afternoon, Silas found the formidable Ohio woman sitting on a rough hay bale in the shadowy barn, her expensive dress gathering dust as she stared into the middle distance. Seeking a quiet refuge from the suffocating tension of the house, she allowed Silas to sit on the opposite wall. In the quiet scent of dry hay and leather, Vivian finally spoke of the dead. She admitted she had skipped her brother's wedding, judging June to be far too willful and stubborn for Thomas. Staring at the dirt floor, Vivian confessed her bitter regret, acknowledging she had been entirely wrong about the fiercely brave woman who had sacrificed everything for those girls. Her sharp gaze then locked onto Silas, piercing straight through his stoic exterior. She demanded to know if he believed the infants were truly happy in this harsh environment. Silas, looking down at his scarred, calloused hands, replied that they were too young for happiness. They only knew the hands that fed them, the voices that soothed them in the dark, and the fierce love Clara poured into their tiny bones. Vivian didn't blink. She bluntly interrogated Silas about his own intentions toward the widow's household. When he admitted he hadn't completely mapped out his future, she respected his raw honesty, conceding that she had expected to find a pitiful, temporary shelter, but had instead discovered something dangerously akin to a real home. The true threat to their makeshift family didn't come in a hired coach. It arrived like a creeping shadow on the evening of Vivian's 6th day. While performing his customary twilight perimeter check, Silas paused by the south fence line. The sky was bleeding into deep, bruised purples when a lone rider materialized on the distant western ridge. The horseman didn't approach and made no attempt to conceal his silhouette. He sat motionless for 3 agonizing minutes, his gaze locked intensely on the Whitmore property, assessing the defenses before melting away into the gathering dark. Silas didn't breathe a word at the dinner table, refusing to panic the women, but once Vivian retired to her room, he quietly relayed the grim sighting to Clara. Her face paled, but her voice remained dead calm as she ordered the hunting rifle brought out of storage. Before Silas could saddle his horse the next morning to alert the law, Sheriff Hale came galloping up the drive in a cloud of frantic dust. Gathering Silas, Clara, and a defiant Vivian in the kitchen, Hale dropped a leaden weight onto their chests. The leader of the murderous syndicate, Cutter Vane, knew Silas had survived the river crossing. Worse, Vane knew exactly where he and the infant witnesses were hiding. The lone rider on the ridge had been Vane's scout, and the ruthless cattle baron was undoubtedly preparing to silence the loose ends permanently. Hale, his face grim with the reality of impending violence, insisted on packing Clara, the twins, and Vivian into a wagon immediately to seek refuge behind the sturdy walls of the town jail. Silas instantly and violently rejected the plan. Moving a loud, cumbersome wagon across miles of open, defenseless prairie was a suicide mission. They would be sitting ducks for Vane's armed ambushers. Staring the sheriff down, Silas argued that the ranch, with its thick wooden walls, elevated sightlines, and natural cover, offered a vastly superior tactical advantage. He challenged Hale to bring his most trusted deputies and heavily armed local ranchers directly to the homestead. The element of surprise was Vane's only true weapon, Silas reasoned coldly. If they fortified the house under the cover of darkness, they could turn the slaughterer's ambush into a devastating trap. Vivian let out a dark, knowing chuckle, staring at Silas with newfound respect. She realized the quiet cowboy had orchestrated this exact type of bloody reversal before. Without a second of hesitation, Clara began writing desperate summons for her loyal ranch hands and their nearest neighbor, preparing her home for a brutal siege. The night descended with an oppressive, suffocating weight. Silas meticulously plotted the ranch's defenses, calculating sightlines and approach vectors with the cold precision of a veteran who knew exactly how predators hunted. Before midnight, Clara's loyal hands arrived, followed by a heavily armed neighbor and Sheriff Hale's tight-lipped deputies. Inside the house, Vivian took command of the safest, windowless interior bedroom, barricading herself with the sleeping twins. Clara found her there at 2 in the morning, a solitary sentinel sitting stiffly in the dark. When Clara tried to urge the older woman to rest, Vivian sharply dismissed the notion. In the quiet gloom, the two women shared a raw, vulnerable moment. Clara, staring at the cradle, outlined the exact, peculiar rhythms needed to soothe each child if the night ended in tragedy. Vivian's stern face softened in the shadows, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper as she promised she already knew. Satisfied, Clara returned to the main room. Silas stood perfectly still by the front window, his silhouette stark against the starlit plains. As they waited for violence to arrive, Clara finally voiced the immense gratitude she held, telling him that June Calloway had prayed for a kind soul to find her babies, and the universe had ultimately sent him. Silas turned, his guarded expression cracking just enough to let the deep, unspoken emotion bleed through the hardened exterior. They heard the muffled thud of hooves before the shadows materialized. 3 riders slipped out of the northern darkness, moving with the terrifying quiet of men intent on murder. Silas wordlessly stepped away from the glass. The trap they had meticulously laid sprang shut with chaotic, deafening violence. Gunfire erupted as the hidden deputies ambushed 2 of the riders near the fence line, the night exploding into flashes of blinding muzzle fire and screaming horses. A 3rd man, however, managed to breach the porch. Silas met him in the narrow doorway, and the brutal, close-quarters brawl was anything but graceful. Fists and bone collided in the suffocating dark. Silas neutralized the threat, but not before taking a devastating blow to his left side, hearing the sickening crunch of his own ribs. A 4th rider panicked and fled into the vast prairie. Silas pursued him on foot, lungs burning, until his battered body simply refused to take another step. Limping back to the glowing windows of the ranch house, he clutched his broken side. Clara pulled him into the warm kitchen, immediately unbuttoning his bloodied shirt to assess the damage. As she tightly bound his bruised ribs with linen, Sheriff Hale appeared in the doorway, his coat dusted with gunpowder. With grim satisfaction, Hale announced that the surviving porch attacker was already singing to save his neck. True to his word, Sheriff Hale returned before sunset the following day with a monumental victory. Acting on the terrified survivor's confession, a heavily armed posse had raided a camp 12 miles north, dragging back a shackled Cutter Vane and 2 of his thugs. Hale stood in Clara's kitchen, hat in hand, detailing the crushing evidence they had unearthed. Vane, blinded by arrogance, had kept a meticulous ledger of his illicit operations, including the bloody raid at the river crossing. Combined with Silas's eyewitness testimony and June's dying letter, the ruthless cattle baron was destined for the gallows. Silas absorbed the news from his chair, his fractured ribs forcing him to breathe in shallow, cautious measures. When Hale departed, the kitchen settled into a fragile domestic quiet. Clara scolded Silas for moving and placed a warm plate of food before him. Breaking the silence, she revealed that Vivian had been interrogating her about her official intentions for the girls. Clara had bravely stated her desire to formally adopt Eleanor and May, fully acknowledging the legal war it might provoke. When Clara turned the question on him, asking what he wanted, Silas stared at her with an unwavering, naked honesty. He didn't just want justice for the dead, he wanted to stay. He wanted to be the father those girls needed. Clara, her hands trembling slightly, whispered that there had always been room. The tension finally broke on the 4th morning following the raid. Vivian Ashcraft took her seat at the breakfast table, folding her manicured hands with the grave intent of a judge preparing to deliver a final verdict. She confessed her original, unyielding plan: to judge the frontier ranch inadequate, seize the children, and cure her own hollow loneliness in Cincinnati. But, she admitted, observing Clara and Silas had dismantled her prejudice entirely. She watched Clara anticipate the infant's needs with instinctual grace, and she had recognized the profound, quiet heroism in Silas's refusal to abandon them. Vivian locked eyes with Clara, her aristocratic voice trembling with raw emotion, stating that those children knew the smells, the sounds, and the profound love of this specific house. She formally announced she would completely relinquish her blood claim. She asked for only one concession: not to take them away, but to be allowed to remain in their lives as a true aunt, returning for holidays and hard times. Clara, stunned by the sheer grace of the surrender, confirmed that the ranch would forever be their home, but Vivian would always have a place in it. Vivian nodded sharply, fighting back tears, and immediately promised to write to the courts and her attorneys to clear the path for Clara's formal adoption. Days later, Vivian's hired coach arrived to ferry her back to the rail station. The departure was charged with unspoken respect. She demanded regular, detailed letters regarding every milestone, every tooth, and every new complaint May managed to voice. After a tender, lingering embrace with the twins, Vivian turned her piercing gaze to Silas, commanding him strictly not to be a stupid man when it came to Clara. With a genuine, rare laugh, she climbed into the coach and rode away without looking back, a woman who only ever moved forward. As the dust settled over the driveway, Clara and Silas stood shoulder to shoulder on the sunlit porch. Silas, favoring his taped ribs, leaned against the wooden rail. He confessed that for 7 weeks he had guarded his tongue, feeling he lacked the right to claim a space in her world. But the agonizing threat of the siege and the Cincinnati aunt's departure had stripped away his hesitation. Turning to Clara, bathed in the golden morning light, Silas finally spoke the words he had carried in his chest. He loved the girls. He loved the ranch. Most of all, he loved her. He asked to stay, not as a drifter or hired help, but as a husband and father. Clara looked into the steady, honest eyes of the man the prairie had delivered to her and whispered a fierce, unwavering yes. The October wedding was a quiet, unadorned affair, exactly as Clara and Silas preferred. The infant girls, completely oblivious to the gravity of the occasion, still managed to loudly voice their opinions. Sheriff Hale stood as their stoic witness, alongside the neighboring Dentons, a handful of loyal ranch hands, and the young supply rider who felt a fierce, personal pride in the household's survival. Even the town's sharpest gossip, a woman who had spent months whispering about the widow's scandalous living arrangement, sent a breathtaking, meticulously stitched quilt days before the vows. Clara draped the beautiful apology over the main room's bed, offering it as a silent, complete response to the town's earlier judgments. The brief ceremony consisted of simple legal language read in Hale's flat, steady voice. Afterward, standing in the crisp autumn sunlight, Clara held Eleanor while Silas wrestled a squirming May. Clara noted that nothing felt entirely different, save for the official paperwork and her new surname. It simply felt as though a truth they had all been living for months had finally been granted a proper title. Then, looking up at her new mother, Eleanor offered her first, genuine, deliberate smile, washing away the last of Clara's guarded defenses. When Hale filed the meticulous adoption papers, the girls were officially listed as Eleanor Calloway Boone and May Calloway Boone. Clara insisted on preserving their blood name. The living owed the dead the honor of carrying their memory forward, ensuring June's sacrifice was never erased. The harsh winter yielded to a vibrant spring, bringing the territorial court date. Clara and Silas rode 40 miles south to a crowded courthouse, where Silas sat for hours delivering measured, damning testimony. Cutter Vane's expensive lawyer withered under the crushing weight of Silas's unwavering memory, Vane's own bloody ledger, and the oilcloth-wrapped letter from a dead mother. When the guilty verdict fell, Silas felt no triumphant joy, only the heavy, quiet relief of a terrible thing finally being finished. Driving the wagon back to the ranch under an endless, pale blue sky, they watched the twins babbling to each other in the back. Clara reflected that the girls would remember absolutely nothing of the slaughter or the desperate ride. They would only know the life built for them afterward. Silas agreed, staring down the long dirt road, confident that the brutal detours of his past had finally led him exactly where he was meant to be. The ensuing years unspooled with the relentless, unglamorous forward momentum of a working frontier ranch. There were bitter winters that tested their endurance and brutal summer droughts that demanded terrifying financial arithmetic. Silas managed the lingering agony of his ruined shoulder with a grim, tight-lipped stubbornness, while Clara anchored the family through every storm. Through it all, the girls grew with an unstoppable vitality. Eleanor became a quiet, fiercely observant child, endlessly interrogating the world with a relentless chain of why, needing to understand the mechanics of everything. May, conversely, was a loud, unstoppable force of nature, falling hard, screaming intensely, and instantly recovering to boss around the neighbors' bewildered grandchildren. Vivian arrived from Cincinnati twice a year like clockwork, seamlessly sliding into their chaotic rhythm. She brought Thomas Calloway's recovered Bible, reading the family genealogies to the girls, and carefully adding Eleanor and May's names in ink below their deceased parents. It was a beautiful, vital tether to their stolen history, ensuring the ghosts of the river crossing were spoken of with love rather than shrouded in silence. The past finally demanded a voice when the girls turned 5. Sitting on a fence rail watching Silas mend a post, a sun-browned Eleanor quietly asked if she had been born on the ranch. Silas set his heavy hammer down, meeting her serious, assessing gaze, a gaze she had inherited from Clara. He gently explained that her first parents had died on a long journey westward, but that her fiercely brave mother had hidden them safely. June had prayed for someone kind to find them, and Clara, Silas, and Aunt Vivian had become that answered prayer. Eleanor processed the heavy truth with scholarly care before whispering that she was incredibly glad Silas had found them. That evening, under a sprawling canopy of brilliant stars, Silas relayed the conversation to Clara on the porch. He mentioned a desire to build a second house on the North Quarter, planning for the distant day the girls might want homes of their own. Clara smiled at the notion of planting such deep, permanent roots in the hard soil. She remembered her early years of hating the unforgiving Nebraska plains, dreaming only of escape, before the land, the man, and the girls had anchored her soul to this specific patch of earth. The vast prairie stretched out around them, alive with the sounds of crickets and a distant, solitary coyote. Clara listened to the soft, steady breathing of the children sleeping securely inside the sturdy walls Silas had built. She thought about the terrifying morning a dying horse had stumbled out of the western horizon. It would have been so easy to bar the door, to hide from the bloody chaos the world had dragged to her gate. But you didn't find the beautiful, vital things by demanding they arrive in comfortable, pristine packages. You found them by standing your ground when disaster loomed, by refusing to look away, and by deciding that whatever broken thing collapsed in your dust was worth walking toward. It was a relentlessly hard way to live, exacting a toll that softer lives never demanded. Yet, sitting on the weathered porch beside the extraordinary man she had once mistaken for a ghost, Clara knew the cost was nothing compared to the reward. They had built a profound, unshakable sanctuary from the ashes of a tragedy. Breathing in the cool scent of the curing summer grass, Clara knew with absolute certainty that this beautiful, imperfect life was more than enough. It was everything.